Hello and welcome to a new tournament recap on my channel. Today we're looking in some of the side events that were played in Toronto. I mixed both of the side events from Sunday in this video so we have like a wider spread of the current meta. Let's start with the first deck. Pretty straightforward, it's like a Ruby Amethyst deck top 16 by Alexander Damron. And as we can see, it's like a pretty basic Ruby Amethyst deck list, except of the Ursula, the 2-ink Ursula and the 7-ink Ursula. Like really strong character, but I don't think it's a really good card. The only reason you play the 2-ink Ursula is because of the shift option you have on turn 5. We see the small Sisu, but we don't see any big Sisus. I would consider playing the big Sisu in this match, maybe playing 1 be prepared or like 2 be prepared and 2 big Sisu, so you have like a wider spread of those cards. We play the Maleficent Sorcerer 2 times, maybe you could like cut her out and play 2 Sisus instead. But what I really like on this list is that he plays like the 4 magic brooms and the 4 channel box followers, so he gains like the card draw, and especially with that 2-cost Ursula you can have like easier matchup against those hyper aggro decks, which didn't make it to the top cut in those tournaments. But as I mentioned in my last video, those decks will probably not win any big tournaments, but the whole meta will be based on this deck. Next up we got the top 16 Ember Emerald deck, and yeah, as we can see, it's like more of a discard deck, and the main goal is Sing Under the Sea, I guess, and to draw cards with Prince John while the opponent is discarding their hand. What's really interesting is the Anna. It's like some people play it like as a one-off, some people play like 2 times. I didn't see any other deck lists that play her more than 2 times at the moment. Of course, it's a pretty straightforward list. I mentioned this in my last video. I think this deck doesn't really have any bad matchups. The only bad thing that could happen for this deck is that you brick, because sometimes you don't get the cards you need to finish that game. But I really think this is a really good deck. You should definitely try it out. I think it will be even more played later in the meta, because some people are just learning to play that deck and learning the combos and so on. And yeah, I think this deck will have a bright future and can definitely see in the top cut in the next event in Birmingham, for example. Next up we have a green bounce deck with the Clarabell. I really like this card. I think on card market it went like from I think 5 to 10 euros to like 30 at the moment. I'm not really sure. For now I think it's like 25 or 30 euros, because people saw that this card has like really big potential in most of the meta decks we see at the moment. As we can see, he plays, it's like, by the way, the top 8 deck, and he plays 3 channel box followers, Flock 4 times Clarabell, the 1-drop, perfect for shifting that 7-cost Clarabell on her. He plays the Pegasus. He's not playing the Shift Pegasus, which is, I don't think, too bad for him. What I can see is also playing the Emerald Chromicon, which is like a really cool item, but I think you should like just like in a testing phase at the moment. I also still don't know if this card is really that great. What I think is really good is the Lyle, because Lyle is like really slowing down those hyper aggro decks and those other decks that are like trying to have an aggressive start. Of course, you play the 2-drop Ursula, you play the 7-drop Ursula. Such a strong card, such an important card in this deck in my opinion. And yeah, we also play the 5-cost Elsa, which is really cool if you like just want to remove those smaller cards, like for example like Cursed Merfolk or something like this, if you don't want them like to get questing for 2 and so on. So I really think it's a great answer for those hyper aggro matchups, and you really have good answers for that late game. For example, against Steel Song you have the big shift Ursula, and I think this deck made it to the top 8 because you don't really have such a bad matchup against other decks. Next up, top 8, also top 8, mid-range Sapphire Steel deck. I didn't see many of those currently. I can see why you play the Captain Hook and the Fire Cannons. Really important for those hyper aggro matchups, so you don't like lose because you're too slow. Of course, some people play the Pete. I can see him here 3 times. I think that's pretty good. That's pretty valid. Playing like, for example, against Mirrors or even against Steel Song or so on, it's a really good answer for it. Of course, Cogsworth is a really good card, and the Cusco is like one card I consider as a really great choice, because you can just remove up to like 1 location, and I think this is a really great choice like in the late game if the opponent plays Queen's Castle or something like that. Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward list. I think Tipo will be like one of the strongest and most played blue characters in the current meta, because the card is just insane, and I also really enjoy playing with it. I tested it a few times. I tested some blue decks, and I think this card is like has a really good potential. Next up, top 4, Steel Song. Pretty straightforward list. Not as many surprises. Maybe the Cinderella is a really cool card. You don't see not in every deck. The Piglet is also really fun, because with Smee and the Piglet, your Smee doesn't lose any life. So you can also play a bit hyper aggro with this deck if you see that your opponent doesn't have any answers against hyper aggro. If your opponent has answers against hyper aggro, that's also not too bad for you, because you can play some songs, you can play Naveen, you can sing a whole new world, you can do so many things with this deck, especially if you have the shift option with Robin Hood and Cinderella. And of course you also play the Pete for the mirror match, so if you play the Pete, your opponent can't play any songs, any actions until the start of your next turn. So you're slowing your opponent down, meanwhile you're like creating a wider board for yourself. And I think it's a really cool deck. It's as I mentioned in my last video, it's like, I think it's an S tier deck. I think it will be one of the best decks in this meta. And yeah, I can see why he plays like 1 Grab Your Sword. I think top decking a Grab Your Sword into like Shift Robin Hood is like really good against those hyper aggro matchups, but I don't think it's like a must play. What I miss here is like the Queen. You can play on turn 2. This would be like an option to play, which I don't see here, but other than that, this is a pretty straightforward list and I really enjoy it. Next we have the 3rd place of the side events. We have a red Mufasa. I think this deck is so funny and it's like really aggressive. It has the card draw with the Rapunzel and with those characters that come in and enters with like 3 damage, for example the Mother Cartel, or with the Teeth and Ambitions. You can actually sing with some of those characters. You can maybe, for example, if you play Doc on 3, you can deal 2 damage on him, and you can like play Rapunzel next turn, like heal him up and draw 2 cards. I think this deck is really good, especially if you see that you have like some surprises, for example like the Goofy, who's like just getting you 2 lore at the end of the game if your opponent has an exerted card. And yeah, the Mufasa is like, it's a bit of a high gamble, but with that list I can see it like compete very well against those other decks that like try to make some aggressive starts at the first few turns. Of course, you also play the Sisu shift, which is pretty cool. And yeah, as I mentioned, I'm not like a big fan of the Mufasa Red Fasa decks because it's like still pretty luck based on what you get with Mufasa. But I really think this is a good list, and that's how you should play Red Fasa. I don't think you should play on too many items and I mean too many characters and like unfocus on those items, because you just want to get that Mufasa effect out. Sometimes your deck also has to win without Mufasa, and this deck can also win again without your Mufasa. So I think it's a pretty good list. Next up, we have the Green Steel Clarabell combo, where you play the Morph and where you are like able to shift many other cards, for example the Beast, Robin Hood, Mother Gothel and Clarabell. I think this list is really great. I really enjoy the consistency of playing every card like 4 times. And as we can see, for example, you play turn 1 Robin Hood, on turn 2 you play Morph, and even if your opponent can like remove one of your characters, it will be very hard for him to like remove one of the other characters in this turn. Yeah, what you maybe could also play is like a Tinkerbell shift. This would be also an option. You could also play a Whole New World, which is also like a tech card you can like try out, but I think going second in that Sunday Lorcana constructed side event is like really great, and you can see this deck is like having a really good time there out there. So maybe we will still see some Emerald Steel in the future, but just without the Bucky. So last but not least, we will go through the red-blue deck that made it first. I think there is like another deck coming in, so it's not the last. It's like I think there is like one deck left, which is a really surprise for me. But yeah, on this deck it's not much to say. Really pretty straightforward red-blue deck. Instead of I think in set 4 you didn't play the 3-cost Sisu, but now with all those hyper aggro decks coming up, I think it's a great choice to play it. I think Vision of the Future is a really interesting card, and I think it has like a really big potential to become like a really good search card for the future for blue, to get that consistency in this deck. As I mentioned, Tipo, best blue card at the moment in my eyes. Like as important as Hiram was on set 4, I think Tipo will be important in set 5. You play 1 Ruby Chromicon. I think you could like even play that 2 times instead of 3 blocks. You can play 2 blocks and 2 Ruby Chromicons. And yeah, with that Sisu you also have the shift option. You play Tamatoa, you play Maleficent, Dragon, you play the Cusco. Pretty straightforward list. I really enjoy it, and I think it's also important to play that Maui, because if your opponent plays a castle or like a location that's really hard to be removed, you can play the Maui and just remove it with him. So I saw some matches and I saw some decks that doesn't play the Maui anymore, and I think they made it themselves really hard to like win against those locations, and I think it's really important to put those cards back in. As for example, the Brawl is also really important, especially if you play the Ice Block. So last but not least, this is a really surprise for me. Sapphire Amethyst made it to top 1. Really cool deck, I really enjoyed. There are so many cool cards in here. What I miss here maybe for myself is when you play the 1-cost Cogsworth, that you play also the Cogsworth with the shift option, because that's insane. If you like on turn 3 you play that 5-cost Cogsworth and shift it into the small Cogsworth, it's like, this is a big surprise for most of the players. I also really like that he plays 4 libraries and 2 castles, so it's like a very location based deck, I think. And yeah, it's like, as always at Amethyst, you play the bounce engines, and here you have some surprises. For example, the Yzma that draws you 2 cards, or your opponent 2 cards, but most of the time you will bounce yourself back some cards. He plays the Bell that removes up to 3 damage counters from a chosen character to another chosen character. And he plays, of course, the new Mufasa, which is like a really insane card. I really enjoyed. I don't think it's such a really good card as many people think it is, but I still think if you like manage to get it out, you have like, and if you manage to get it out and play it out correctly, you have a really straightforward win with that card. Of course, you have the hardest. As I mentioned in my last video, just bouncing back and back and back, and you have like a free let it go every turn, which is insane with those bounce engines you have here. And with Cusco, you're also removing opponents' locations easily with that. So this was like a quick recap of all those Sunday decks. I hope you guys liked it. Leave a like, subscribe, and see you guys soon. Bye.